Hello, and welcome to Jenna Rereads The Silmarillion, Episode 5, Never Go on a Road Trip with the Teleri. So, hi everybody. I have to start this one off with an apology. I'm sorry that this is a week late. I guess the only excuse I'm going to give is, much like the Teleri, I got distracted and wandered off and didn't get this done. So anyway, to compensate for that, you are getting 2 chapters this week. That's right. We will be discussing 2 chapters for the price of 1. Never mind that the second chapter is like a page and a half long. We'll just ignore that. It's still 2 chapters. And it's the elves. The elves finally wake up. 5 chapters into this book, and we're finally getting to meet the elves. Now, I should warn you before we get started, this one is going to be a little bit confusing because we've got the different groups of elves that we're going to be introduced to. So I will do my best to try to simplify it and make it less confusing. So anyway, let's get started. So if you'll recall, the state of things in the last chapter was that Melkor was running amok completely unchecked in Middle-earth, and the Valar were holed up in Valinor working on various projects. Aule had his arts and crafts project of dwarves officially approved by Iluvatar, and Yavanna had some Ents created in response to that. So that was basically where things stood. The Valar were eagerly awaiting the coming of the children of Iluvatar, but they didn't know exactly when that was going to take place, and they still don't know. So, at the opening of this chapter, nothing has really changed. The Valar are pretty much ignoring Middle-earth, with the exceptions of Ulmo, Yavanna, and Orome. Orome keeps going over there to hunt for Melkor's monsters and stuff. And Melkor is gathering his strength in his fortress of Autumno, and he also builds another fortress. Now, you want to remember this one, because it's going to be very important later, called Angband, which is located in the part of Middle-earth that's called Beleriand. One thing, I might as well just talk about this now, to make it clear. If you're, thinking of the Lord of the Rings maps of Middle-earth and are like, okay, where the hell is Beleriand? Well, we'll just say when there are sort of big, epic, cataclysmic wars that happen in Middle-earth, it tends to alter the geography. Beleriand was basically this whole sort of, I guess you could call it a subcontinent. Anyway, this whole region that was located to the west of the Blue Mountains. You may remember that the Blue Mountains are basically in the far west of the Lord of the Rings maps, like right near the coast. Well, that was the far eastern part of Beleriand. So that's where Beleriand is. And it's where most of the action of this book is going to take place. So it's important to understand where it is. So Melkor builds his sort of secondary fortress of Angband in Beleriand for the purpose of it being sort of like a outpost, an extra defense against any attack that might come from the Valar, because they would be coming from that direction. And he sets Sauron to guard it. Sauron is like his number 2 guy, second in command after him. So that's Angband. Now, the Valar are having another discussion about what they're going to do about Middle-earth and Melkor and everything. And Yavanna and Tolkas are all for taking out Melkor. But once again, the Valar decide to just not do anything about Melkor. Although Mondos is yeah, the children of Iluvatar are going to wake up soon. So Varda goes on a little creation spree, and she basically creates a bunch of stars, because you remember she's the Vala associated with stars and light. And we, of course, get a long list of the names of different stars, which we really don't need to go into. But the interesting one is she creates a constellation called the Valasirka, which is sickle-shaped, and hangs it over the north as a warning to Melkor that they're coming for him. Well, at least they're coming for him eventually, one of these days. But not today or tomorrow or next week, but eventually. So after Varda has created all of these stars and set them in the heaven, finally, the firstborn, the elves, wake up at Cuiviénen. Now, you're probably saying, where the hell is Cuiviénen? And that's a rather strange word, but it's kind of fun to say, Cuiviénen. It's like a lake located in the far east of Middle-earth, but they don't know exactly where, because, the geography has changed since then. So, they can't just go back to it. So the elves have woken up under the starlight, because remember, the light of the two trees does not reach to Middle-earth. Middle-earth is just totally under starlight right now. So they wake up under the starlight. And it's because of this that the elves are really, really, really into stars. And Varda is the one Vala that they revere above all the others, because they woke up under the stars. So they are just totally sort of in wonder at this world that they've woken up into. And they start creating languages because, hey, this is Tolkien. So, what's the first thing you do when you wake up as a created being in the world is create a language, which, yeah, I guess it makes sense. So they call themselves the Quendi. Now, you want to remember this because we're going to start to get into these different divisions of the elves, really soon. So the Quendi is the name that they give themselves. And it just means, people who speak with voices. Because they haven't encountered any other, sentient beings. So that's what they call themselves. So the elves they're just kind of hanging out at Cuiviénen, looking at the stars and naming things. And Orome happens to wander into their midst, just randomly. And completely by chance. The Valar have been waiting and waiting for the children of Ilúvatar, and now Orome just sort of happens upon them. But unfortunately, Melkor has actually gotten to them first. Melkor's got all his monsters and evil servants prowling around, and they've, kidnapped elves and stuff. So Melkor has kind of, filled the elves with fear of this dark rider that comes in the night and just gonna snatch them away. So some of the elves are really kind of afraid of Orome, and they, hide themselves when he shows up. And some of the other things that Melkor does to the elves are really, not very pleasant. So he captures a bunch of them and takes them to Autumno and basically just tortures them. He tortures them horrifically. And this is the origin of orcs. Now, I should say there's one sort of note here that apparently Tolkien kind of went back and forth on this and changed his mind about the origin of orcs. But this is the version that's actually in the text here. That orcs are tortured elves. Think about that for a minute. And think about, how much torture they would have had to undergo to make them into orcs. So, yeah, you can imagine it was pretty freaking terrifying for the elves being at Cuiviénen, and, some of their friends wander off, they disappear, they never see them again, there's all these monsters and things, and then this guy just shows up on this bright, shining horse with, gold hooves and stuff. I mean, I think I'd be a little freaked out, to be quite honest. But this is the consequence of the Valar's inaction in dealing with Melkor. He does get to the elves first, and a bunch of them have to suffer because of it. So yeah, this is also another thing, that Melkor can't create life of his own. All he can do is just like mock other people's creations. See what he's doing? He's mocking Iluvatar's creations by torturing them. Um, and there's actually a line in here that says, "This, it may be, was the vilest deed of Melkor and the most hateful to Iluvatar." And yeah, it really kind of is. It really is. And he's going to do some other pretty awful stuff, but this has got to be in the top 5 moments of evil and horribleness for him. So, okay, so Orme's talking to the elves, and meanwhile, the Valar have another discussion about what to do. That it's time that they finally dealt with Melkor. So they all get together and they head over to Middle-earth and they just freaking take Melkor out. They attack Autumno. Although it's not a curb stomp battle. Like, it takes a while before they manage to break through. And the elves are just sitting there and they're like, all this rumbling and flashing in the distance as they're all of these Maiar and Valar and Melkor are all battling each other. And they're going to be like, what the hell's going on? Because they really didn't know very much about it. But the Valar eventually succeed, although, as I mentioned before, some of the geography ends up being changed as a result of their warring with Melkor. And the sea that separates Middle-earth from Aman gets wider and deeper. But anyway, so they capture Melkor, and like Tolkas freaking wrestles with him, which results in Melkor taking a dirt nap. Because remember, Tolkas came into the world just for the purpose of beating the shit out of Melkor, and he finally gets the opportunity to do it. So they chain Melkor up with this big ass chain that Aule made, and they drag him back to Valinor. Unfortunately, the Valar don't really do as thorough a job with Autumno and Angband as they probably should have done, because some of Melkor's servants, Balrogs and Sauron and stuff, they're still hanging out there, and the Valar don't capture them, so they're just kind of biding their time in Middle-earth. It's like, yeah, I'm sure that's not going to cause problems later. Make sure you do a thorough job. If you're attacking a Dark Lord in his fortress, make sure you freaking, like, get in there, you get in all the secret passages, all the secret tunnels, and make sure that none of his, like, top lieutenants escape. Make sure they're all accounted for. And if you don't find them, fucking, like, make it your priority to find them. Yeah, this is going to come up again. But anyway, so Melkor has been taken back to Valinor, and what they decide to do with him is chuck him in the halls of Mondos for 3 ages. If you recall, the halls of Mondos are where dead elves go when they die, and probably also dead dwarves, and, like, it's impossible for anybody, including a Vala, to escape from the halls of Mondos. So they figure, hey, that's a good place to put Melkor. Maybe 3 years in the halls of Mondos ought to chill him out. So they put him in there. And then they make another decision. They have another discussion of what they're going to do about the elves. They decide that they want to offer to let the elves come live with them in Valinor. They're like, oh, Middle-earth is just too dangerous. Yeah, we got rid of Melkor, but a lot of his, servants are still out there. But Ulmo actually opposes this. He says that the elves should be left free to, walk and live as they will in Middle-earth, and use their gifts to heal it from all of the hurts and damage that Melkor has done. But the other Valar are all like, let's invite them to Valinor so we can teach them stuff, which is what they've been wanting to do, like, all the way back since the Ainulindale. So Ulmo, meanwhile, rolls his eyes and is like, why doesn't anybody ever listen to me? I bet this isn't gonna backfire at all. So the elves are a little unsure about this. But eventually, some of them come forward and are like, oh, okay, I guess we could think about this. And then Orme is like, okay, well, we'll pick 3 ambassadors from these 3 different groups you guys have, like, sorted yourselves into. And you guys can come to Valinor, see what it's like, and then tell everybody else about it, and then you guys can decide if you want to come or not. So, the 3 ambassadors he picks are Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë. Now, Ingwe isn't terribly important, but Finwë and Elwë are going to be very important, so you want to remember them. These 3 are going to become kings. But Finwë and Elwë are more important. So they go back with Orme to Valinor. They check it out. They're like, hey, this is pretty sweet. It's paradise. So they go back to their people and tell them all about how super awesome Valinor was. But not all of the elves are sold. Some of the others are like, no, see, I actually kind of like it here, and it's a really long journey. It's probably going to be dangerous. So, no thanks. I think I'm cool. I'm cool right where I am, okay? So, these elves, the ones who choose not to accept the Valar summons and go to Valinor, are called the Avari, or the Unwilling. They're sometimes also called Dark Elves. And the elves who do choose to accept the Valar's invitation are called the Eldar. So we got that. This is our first division of the elves. The Avari are the elves who decline the Valar summons and choose to stay in Middle-earth. And the Eldar are the elves who do accept the Valar summons and decide to make the journey and go to live in Valinor. The Avari we're not really going to hear much about ever again in, like, any of Tolkien's writing. They just sort of, like, disappear. I said we never really hear about them much. Like, all of the elves that we're going to deal with are going to be Eldar. So, the Eldar are divided into 3 hosts. The smallest one is led by Ingwe, and they are called the Vanyar. Okay, thing you know about the Vanyar. They're blonde, they're prissy, and they're really boring. Like, they don't do anything! Now, I guess you could say, considering what happens in the rest of this book, that the Vanyar are actually the smartest, because they just stay out of everything. But anyway, they're blonde and prissy, and Manwë and Varda love them best. And for some reason, Ingwe is considered the High King of all the elves. Why? I don't know. I kind of get the feeling it's because the Valar like them best, so they're like, you can be the High King, which I have to disapprove of strongly. It's like, okay, Valar, stop meddling in, elvish affairs, particularly when it comes to how they govern themselves, guys. So now we got the next group, and this is the Noldor, and they're awesome. Okay, I may be a tiny bit biased. Okay, I like the Noldor a lot. I'm an Noldor fangirl. But the Noldor are Finwë's people. Yes, Finwë is the High King of the Noldor. The Noldor are basically really into making stuff. They love making things. They're called the Deep Elves, or the Wise Ones, because they're into that kind of stuff. They're into lore and making things. And then we've got the third group. The third group is called the Teleri, and they are by far the biggest group. The Teleri are like the elves of indecision, because they sort of dilly-dally, and they just sort of wander around while everybody else is heading to Valinor. They, wander off and are like, oh, look at the trees. And some of them are like, well, I don't know. I guess we'll go to Valinor. Um, so their whole thing is that they're really into nature. They like trees and forests and stuff, and they're also really into the sea. I know that seems sort of contradictory, but there's like a lot of different groups and like subgroups of Teleri that we're going to be introduced to. But kind of the main group that actually manages to get to Amon is just going to still be called the Teleri, and they're the sea elves. They love the sea, they live by the sea, and so that's them. And they actually have two leaders. They've got two kings because their host is so big. There's Elwë. I said remember him because he's going to be very important. And Olwë. Yes, all of these elvish kings have names that end in way. So, okay. Those are those divisions of the elves. If we want to review, okay, we've got the Avari, elves that stay behind in Middle-earth, the Eldar, the elves who decide to take up the Valar's offer and go to Valinor. Under the Eldar, we've got three subgroups. We've got the Vanyar, who are blonde and prissy, and the Valar love them. We've got the Noldor, who are awesome and love lore and making things. And we've got the Teleri, who are really indecisive, and they like trees and forests and the ocean. Okay, so, moving on. We're going to get another way of dividing up the elves. Yay! Okay, so, we've got Calaquendi and Moraquendi. Now, the Calaquendi are the elves of the light. Basically, this refers to all of the elves who actually get all the way to Valinor and live in Valinor while the two trees are there. The two trees have a interesting effect on elves. Like, it's sort of like, I guess, superpowers them, the sort of energy or whatever they absorb from the trees. So the Calaquendi are they're usually described as being greater in stature and like more powerful than the Moraquendi. Moraquendi are elves who never saw the trees. So like all of the Avari are Moraquendi by default, and then some of like the Teleri are Moraquendi because some of the Teleri don't actually make it to Valinor, so they never get to see the trees. So that's what that means. Okay. So they are making the journey, and it takes quite a while because they've got to cross all the way from the east of Middle-earth, so they got a ways to go. But like the Teleri keep wandering off and getting distracted by like interesting trees and stuff. And they get to the Misty Mountains, which, fun tidbit, the Misty Mountains were created by Melkor to hinder the riding of Orome. So a bunch of Teleri, they get there, a bunch of Teleri are like, oh, I don't really feel like crossing those mountains, so I guess we'll just stay here. So this group of Teleri that breaks off is called the Nandor, and they have a leader. Guess what his name is? Lenwë! You knew it was going to be something way. So, yeah, they just break off east of the Misty Mountains, and these guys are going to become, like, the elves of Lothlorien and Mirkwood, basically. Although there's other groups of elves that come in there, too. But, anyway, so these guys are, like, the ancestors of them. So they're hanging out there. The Vanyar and the Noldor cross over into Beleriand, and from there, they cross over to... they're going to cross over to Valinor. And then the Teleri finally get there to join them. So the Teleri have just gotten to Beleriand, and they're wandering around and stuff, and Elwë decides to wander around in the forest of Nan Elmoth. He's looking for his pal Finwë. He and Finwë were friends. but he happens to run into a little distraction along the way. You guys remember Melian the Maya? I'm sure you remember all of the information that we covered in the Valaquenta. Well, Melian likes to visit Middle-earth, and dance and sing in the forest like a Disney princess. And while Elwë is wandering around in the forest of Nan Elmoth, what should he come upon but Melian dancing and singing? And they see each other, and it's love at first sight. And Melian puts a kind of spell on him. And they stand there, like, staring at each other for years. No, I'm not even exaggerating. It says years. They stare at each other for years. And they're so totally entranced with each other that it's like love at first sight. They see each other and then it's like, oh, staring. So, meanwhile, the Teleri are like, anybody seen Elwë? Seems like we haven't seen him in a while. Could something have happened to him? So they eventually decide to just, have Elwë is going to just be their leader from now on. And they're like a group of them breaks off to try to find him. And he decides that he's not going to go to Valinor. Despite the fact that he was one of the original ambassadors, he's going to stay in Middle-earth, thank you very much. He found a hot Maya that he wants to marry, so he's just going to stay put where he is. So yeah, we have an elf-Maya pairing here, which is very interesting. Do you remember back in the Valaquenta where I was talking about the Valar marriages and how they, don't seem to reproduce with each other? Well, we're going to find out here with Elwë and Melian, that they can apparently reproduce with elves. So, yeah, they get married and are going to set up a kingdom here in Beleriand. And the group of elves, there's going to be a bunch of Teleri that are going to eventually find them. And they're going to choose to stay with them. And these guys are going to be called the Sindar, or the Grey Elves. In that they're a group of Teleri that were making the journey, but never quite actually got all the way to Valinor. And it also has to do with Elwë's sort of nickname, which is Grey Cloak. And that the word for that is Thingle. So that's what he's going to be called for most of the rest of this book. They don't really call him Elwë much past this, and he'll be referred to as Thingle. Yes, because this is Tolkien, every character has to have multiple names. So yeah, I hope that wasn't too confusing. So that is the two chapters that I wanted to cover of the coming of the elves and the captivity of Melkor and of Thingle and Melian. So, okay, the big discussion point for me with this one is, did the Valar make the right call in inviting the elves to come live with them in Valinor? And my stance on this is that they didn't. It was the wrong decision, and they should have freaking listened to Ulmo. That's going to be a theme. People not listening to Ulmo. So, the reasons that Ulmo brings up for why they should let the elves just stay in Middle-earth is that they could, use their powers and gifts to heal Middle-earth of, all the harm that Melkor has done. And we're going to kind of see that, too. Melian is there, certainly doing her part, and the elves could have helped out as well. And it's like, they should have just left the elves to their own devices, I think. It's sort of, I don't want to go, to make this into some kind of social justice thing. I really don't. If you want that, go on, you can find that other places on Tumblr, but it's almost sort of imperialistic in that, I mean, I know it's different because, well, yeah, okay. The Valar literally are superior beings. I mean, they're gods. But it's kind of like they're just sort of going in and almost, you know, sort of preventing the elves from developing naturally as a people, I guess. Although they do teach the elves some really cool stuff, as we're going to see, and are like, the elves come up with things that they had never thought of, and they're amazed by the stuff they come up with in turn. But I just kind of feel like they should have just, left the elves to their own devices, really. Go get rid of Melkor, but don't, sort of impose yourselves on them in that way, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And so, yeah, that's what I think that they probably should have done. It's interesting because apparently Tolkien himself, felt that it was the wrong decision for them to invite the elves to Valinor, and that they should have stayed to Middle-earth to heal its hurts and all of that. So yeah, I guess I feel sort of vindicated in that that was what the author apparently intended for us to think about this. It's too bad that like the Avari, I said they just basically disappear after this chapter. We find out very, very little about them. And you do have to wonder what they're like, without that influence of the Valar. How different they are. But it's not anything that ever gets expanded on in canon, which I think is kind of unfortunate. So anyway, we are going to see, eventually the Valar's decision to invite the elves to Valinor is going to backfire spectacularly. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself or too spoilery because there'll be plenty of time to talk about that when we get there. So anyway, let's see. I think that's pretty much all I've got to say about this. This is the longest one I've ever done. Wow, we're like over a half hour here. But, when we've got 2 chapters and a lot of stuff to talk about in them, that's going to happen. So anyway, that's it for this one, and I'll see you guys next time.